15 feet. That is the distance between a husband and survival, between a son and the rest of his life, between everything Lenore Ashford loved and the cold embrace of a Montana blizzard that would take it all away. 15 feet, close enough to touch if you reached out your arm, close enough to hear a voice calling your name, close enough that in the silence between gusts of wind, you might hear someone breathing. But in a storm that turned the world white and blind and murderous, 15 feet might as well have been 15 miles. This is where our story begins. Not with the cave that would save 27 lives, not with the mockery that would follow a widow for 2 years, not with the storm that would force an entire town to its knees. It begins with 15 feet of snow and two voices calling in the dark, and a woman who would spend the rest of her life making sure no one else ever fell short by that distance again. March of 1879. The wagon train stretched across the prairie like a wounded snake. 63 souls making their way from Missouri to Montana territory. Farmers and dreamers. Families looking for a fresh start in a land they had never seen. They had been traveling for weeks, and the weariness showed in everything. It showed in the way the oxen plodded forward with their heads low, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. It showed in the way the children had stopped asking how much farther, their eyes tired, and their curiosity dulled by endless miles of the same brown grass and gray sky. It showed in the creaking of wagon wheels that had already rolled 1,000 miles and still had hundreds more to go. Lenore Ashford walked beside the lead wagon with the steady gait of a woman who had spent 3 years on her feet during the war between the states. She was 47 years old. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, and her hands bore the calluses of honest work. But her eyes were still sharp, her back was still straight, and her mind was still the same mind that had kept soldiers alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. She had been an army nurse during the Civil War. She had stitched boys back together after battles that turned fields into slaughterhouses. She had held the hands of young men no older than 16 while they died calling for their mothers. She had seen gangrene and dysentery and wounds that no amount of medical knowledge could heal. She had seen things that would break most people. She thought nothing could break her anymore. She was wrong. Her husband Ezra walked on the other side of the wagon leading the oxen with the quiet patience that had made her fall in love with him 20 years before. Everyone called him Ez. He was a tall man with gentle eyes and hands rough from honest work. The kind of man who never raised his voice but never had to. The kind of man who could calm a frightened horse or a crying child with the same steady presence. He had served in the cavalry before the war ended. He had seen his share of violence and death. But unlike so many men who came home hardened and hollow, Ezra had come home softer, more grateful, more determined to build something good with whatever years he had left. When Lenora watched him walk beside those oxen, she sometimes felt a gratitude so deep it frightened her. She had survived the war. She had come home to this man. She had been given a second chance at a life that made sense. Behind them, their son Josiah drove the second wagon. 16 years old, already taller than his father, already dreaming of the land they would claim in Montana, the house he would help build, the life that stretched out ahead of him like an open road with no end in sight. He had his father's gentle eyes and his mother's stubbornness. And when he smiled, which was often, Lenora could see the man he was becoming. A good man, a strong man, a man who would make his parents proud. She did not know that she had less than 3 hours left with both of them. She did not know that by nightfall she would be alone. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was clear. The March sun was warming the canvas tops of the wagons. Children were playing a game that involved throwing pine cones at a bucket tied to the back of Mr. Henderson's wagon. Women were talking about what they would plant in their new gardens. Men were discussing the best way to build a cabin that would survive a Montana winter. The next moment, the world turned white. The wind hit them with a force that staggered the oxen and sent canvas ripping from wagon hoops like paper torn by giant hands. The temperature dropped so fast that Lenora could feel it happening. One breath was cold. The next breath was colder. The third breath burned. The snow did not fall from the sky the way snow usually falls. It came from everywhere at once. From above, from the sides, from the ground itself, whipped up by winds that seemed determined to bury everything in their path. Within seconds, Lenora could not see the wagon in front of her. Within a minute, she could not see her own hand in front of her face. Ezra had gone to gather firewood, just 30 feet from the wagon, a distance he could cover in seconds on a normal day. He had taken Josiah with him, father and son working together the way they always did, the way they had worked together for 16 years. Lenora heard them calling. She heard their voices for 20 minutes. Ezra calling her name, Josiah calling for help. Their voices came from everywhere and nowhere at once, scattered by the wind until it seemed like the prairie itself was screaming. She tried to walk toward them. The wind knocked her down. She crawled on her hands and knees, calling back, screaming, until her throat was raw and her voice was nothing but a ragged whisper lost in the howling white. But she could not see anything. Not the wagons, not the other travelers, not her husband, not her son. The snow was so thick it was like being submerged in white water, like drowning in a river made of ice and wind and cold that bit through clothing and skin and muscle until it reached the bones. Her fingers found a crack in the rock face, a narrow opening in the limestone that she had not noticed before, a gap between two slabs of ancient stone barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. She did not think. She did not hesitate. She pushed herself into that crack, scraping skin from her arms and face, tearing her dress on the rough stone. And suddenly the wind stopped. The howling that had been trying to drive her mad was replaced by silence. The snow that had been blinding her was suddenly gone. The cold that had been killing her was suddenly bearable. The temperature inside the crack was not warm, but it was warmer, not comfortable, but survivable. The difference between life and death. Lenora called for Ezra and Josiah until her voice gave out completely. She screamed their names into the white nothing beyond the crack until she tasted blood in her throat. She listened for their voices with every fiber of her being. They never answered. For 3 days, Lenora huddled in that limestone crack. She had no food, no water except what she could lick from the damp stone walls, no light except the faint gray glow that filtered through the narrow entrance during what she assumed was day. She prayed. She wept. She made promises to God that she knew she could never keep. She lay in the darkness and wondered why she had survived when the people she loved had not. She wondered what kind of cruel joke the universe was playing on her. She wondered if she was being punished for something she had done during the war. Some soldier she could not save. Some wound she had dressed wrong. Some moment when she had given up on someone who might have lived if she had tried harder. The silence of the third day was worse than the screaming of the first, because by the third day she knew. She knew they were not coming. She knew she would never hear Ezra's voice again, never see Josiah smile, never feel her husband's arms around her, or watch her son grow into the man he was meant to become. She knew she was alone. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. Lenora crawled out into a world that looked like nothing she had ever seen. The wagons were buried. Only the tops of the canvas covers poked through the snow like white tombstones marking graves that held everything these families had owned. The cattle were dead, frozen where they stood, their legs locked in place, their eyes open and staring at nothing, frost covering their bodies like a shroud made of ice crystals. She found the Henderson family huddled together under a canvas that had done nothing to save them. All 5 of them. The parents wrapped around their 3 children in a final embrace that would last until spring when someone found them and gave them a proper burial. She found an old Mr. Patterson sitting against a wagon wheel with his pipe still in his hand. Frozen solid, his face peaceful, like he had simply decided to sit down and never get up again. She found Mrs. Campbell and her 2 daughters lying in the snow 10 feet from their wagon, so close to shelter, so close to survival, but not close enough. 47 of the 63 people in that wagon train died. 47 people who had left Missouri with dreams of a new life in Montana. 47 people who had survived months of travel only to die within sight of their destination. And then Lenora found them, Ezra and Josiah, 15 feet from their crack in the limestone, 15 feet from the shelter that had saved her life. They were lying together in the snow, father and son. Ezra's arm was around Josiah's shoulders. Josiah's head was resting against his father's chest. They had died holding each other, but their bodies were oriented toward the crack, toward the shelter, toward her. They had been trying to reach her. Their frozen hands were stretched out toward the limestone, toward the narrow opening that would have meant warmth, that would have meant survival, that would have meant life. If they had found that crack, they would have lived. They would have survived the way she survived. They would have crawled out on the fourth morning and held each other and wept with relief. They would have continued on to Montana and built the life they had dreamed about. They would have grown old together, but they had not found it. They had been so close. 15 feet. Close enough that if Ezra had reached out his arm, his fingertips might have brushed the edge of the rock. Close enough that in the silence between gusts of wind that they might have heard her breathing. Close enough that she had heard their voices calling her name for 20 minutes while she sat in the darkness unable to help them. 15 feet. The dog lay between them. Copper. A brown mutt with one white ear who had been with the family since Josiah was 12 years old. He had followed the boy everywhere. He had slept at the foot of Josiah's bed every night. He had been as much a part of their family as any of them. And he was still breathing. Barely. His body was pressed against Ezra on one side and Josiah on the other, as if he had been trying to keep them warm with nothing but his own failing body heat, as if he had refused to leave them even when staying meant dying. When Lenora knelt in the snow and pressed her face against her husband's frozen cheek, Copper crawled to her. He pushed his head against her chest. He was shivering so violently that his whole body shook. But he was alive. He had stayed with his masters until the end, and somehow, impossibly, he had survived. Lenora carried that dog for 2 miles until she found other survivors. She never let him go again. 15 feet. That is the distance between Lenora's husband and survival. Between her son and a life he never got to live. Between everything she loved and everything she lost. If you lost everyone you love because of 15 feet, because of a shelter that was almost big enough but not quite, because of a crack in the rock that could have saved 3 lives but only saved 1. What would you do with the rest of your life? What would you build? Chapter 2, The Mad Woman's Purpose. For 3 years after the wagon train, Lenora drifted. She worked as a nurse in mining camps where men lost fingers and arms and sometimes their lives to the mountains they were trying to hollow out. She cooked in hotels where travelers passed through on their way to somewhere better. She took whatever work would keep her fed and give her a reason to open her eyes each morning. But every night she heard Ezra calling her name. Every night she saw Josiah's face in the snow. Every night she lay in whatever narrow bed she had rented and stared at the ceiling and wondered why she had lived when they had not. Copper slept beside her through all of it. The old dog had recovered from the storm, but he was never quite the same. He was quieter now, more watchful. He stayed close to Lenora at all times as if he was afraid that if he let her out of his sight, she might disappear the way Ezra and Josiah had disappeared. Sometimes she caught him staring at the door, waiting for someone who was never going to walk through it. She understood the feeling. The answer came to her slowly. Not like a revelation, not like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, but like a sunrise so gradual that she did not notice the light until it was already there. She had survived because of the cave. The limestone crack had saved her life. The earth itself had protected her when the sky tried to kill her. Her father had taught her about this. Cornelius Trelawney, a miner from Cornwall, England, who had spent 40 years working underground and lived to be 83 years old. He had come to America when Lenora was a child. He had worked in mines from Pennsylvania to Colorado. He had survived cave-ins and floods and explosions that killed men standing right beside him. And he had explained to her when she was just a girl sitting on his knee how caves held steady temperatures year-round. 54 degrees in summer, 54 degrees in winter. It did not matter what the weather did above ground. The earth held steady. The earth kept its promises. The earth does not change its mind, her father used to say, his Cornish accent thick even after decades in America. The sky can turn on you in an instant. A sunny day can become a deadly storm before you can draw breath. But the earth keeps its promises. The earth holds steady. The earth protects those who know how to ask for its protection. Lenora had not thought about those words in years, but now they came back to her with a force that made her chest ache. Ezra and Josiah had died mere steps from that promise, close enough to touch, close enough that she had heard their voices until the very end. If that crack had been bigger, if there had been supplies stored inside, if someone had prepared a shelter in the earth where people could go when the sky turned murderous, her husband and her son would still be alive. That was the thought that transformed her grief into purpose. That was the thought that turned a broken woman into a builder. In the spring of 1882, Lenora Ashford arrived in Copper Ridge, Montana Territory. She was 50 years old, a widow with no children, a woman with nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. She had lost everything that mattered, and in the strange mathematics of grief that made her free. Free to do the thing that no one else would do. Free to look foolish. Free to be called crazy. Because what could they take from her that had not already been taken? She bought 40 acres of rocky, worthless land on the eastern edge of town. The land cost almost nothing because no one wanted it. It was too rocky to farm, too far from water to raise cattle, too remote to be convenient for anything. The only thing it had was limestone cliffs and a small cave opening that most people walked past without noticing. Lenora noticed. She moved into the cave the day she bought the land. What she found inside changed everything. The entrance was small, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, a gap between two limestone slabs that looked like just another crack in the rock face. The kind of thing you might glance at and then forget. But beyond that narrow gap, the cave opened into something remarkable. A chamber large enough to stand in, walls of solid limestone carved by water over thousands of years, and passages, dark openings that led deeper into the earth, promising more chambers, more space, more shelter. For 3 weeks, Lenora explored with nothing but a lantern and a ball of string. She marked her path carefully, never going so far that she could not find her way back. She moved slowly and methodically the way her father had taught her to move through unexplored tunnels. She tested the rock with her knuckles, listening for the hollow sound that meant weakness. She watched for water stains that might indicate flooding during heavy rains. And with each exploration, she discovered more. A second chamber larger than the first. A third chamber with a ceiling so high her lantern light could not reach it. A narrow passage that led to an underground spring. Water so clear and cold it took her breath away. The cave system was enormous. Far larger than anyone in Copper Ridge suspected. Large enough to shelter 50 people. Maybe more. Large enough to save lives when the next storm came. Because another storm would come. That was the one thing Lenora knew with absolute certainty. The sky would turn murderous again. The cold would come hunting. The wind would blow with killing force. It was not a question of if. It was only a question of when. And when that storm came, she would be ready. Lenora told no one what she had found. She had learned from the mockery that followed her everywhere. The whispers in the mining camps, the sidelong glances in the hotel kitchens, the way people looked at her when they learned she was the widow from the wagon train, the one who had survived when her family had not. If she told people about the caves, they would find reasons to dismiss her. They would say she was exaggerating. They would say she was crazy. They would say that a woman had no business doing a man's work. They would say anything except the one thing that mattered. So she kept her secret. She would build the shelter first. She would make it ready. She would stockpile supplies and reinforce walls and create a place where people could survive anything the sky threw at them. And when the time came, when people needed it, the caves would be there waiting. The first person to mock her was Sheriff Virgil Cranston. He rode out to her property 3 days after she arrived. A big man of 55 with a badge that he wore like it was part of his body and a voice that carried the weight of 20 years as the only law in a small town. He had known Ezra during the war. They had served together in the cavalry before Ezra settled down with Lenora. When Ezra died in the 1879 storm, word had reached Virgil months later. He had written Lenora a letter expressing his condolences. That letter had been kind. The man who sat on his horse staring at her cave was not. Lenora was hauling limestone rubble out of the cave mouth when he arrived. Her hands were bleeding. Her dress was torn and covered in dust. She looked like a madwoman, and she knew it. "What in God's name are you doing, Lenora?" "Building a shelter." "A shelter?" He said the word like it tasted bad, like she had offered him something rotten. "You mean you are living in a hole in the ground? I am preparing a place where people can survive when the weather turns. People have houses for that." Lenora straightened her back and looked up at the man on the horse. She did not flinch. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself the way women were expected to explain themselves to men who questioned their judgment. Houses burn. Houses collapse. Houses cannot keep you alive when it is 40 below zero and the wind is strong enough to knock down walls. Virgil shook his head. The disappointment on his face was the kind reserved for children who refused to learn their lessons. for fools who insisted on making the same mistakes over and over again. Ezra would spin in his grave seeing his wife living like a groundhog. The words hit Lenora like a slap. She stopped hauling rubble. She straightened her back even further. She looked up at the man on the horse, the man who had served with her husband, the man who claimed to be his friend. Ezra died because there was no shelter. He died 15 feet from a cave that could have saved his life. If that cave had been bigger, if it had been prepared, if there had been supplies inside, my husband and my son would still be alive. That was 5 years ago. You need to move on. I have moved on. I have moved on to making sure no one else dies the way they died. Virgil opened his mouth to argue. Then he closed it. He shook his head again and turned his horse toward town. The leather of his saddle creaked. The horse's hooves crunched on the rocky ground. He did not look back. Do what you want, but do not expect anyone to take you seriously, and do not expect me to rescue you when that cave collapses on your head. Lenora watched him ride away. Then she picked up her shovel and went back to work. The mockery spread through Copper Ridge like fire through dry grass. Within a week, everyone in town knew about the widow who lived in a cave. They called her the Mad Woman. They called her Cave Crazy. Children dared each other to ride past her property, though none were brave enough to approach. Mayor Aldrich Pemberton came to see her on a Sunday afternoon. He was 58 years old, a prosperous man who owned the bank and 3 of the best buildings in town. He wore a suit even in the middle of summer. He walked like he expected people to get out of his way, and they usually did. Mrs. Ashford, I understand you are experiencing some difficulties. Lenora was hauling water from the underground spring she had discovered deep inside the cave system. She kept hauling. She did not stop to acknowledge the mayor's presence. She did not curtsy or apologize or act grateful for his attention. I am not experiencing difficulties. I am building a shelter. Yes. Well, that is precisely what concerns me. The mayor looked around at the rough stone walls, at the piles of rubble, at the timber supports that Lenore had begun installing. His nose wrinkled, his lip curled. He had the expression of a man who had stepped in something unpleasant. Copper Ridge is a respectable town. We are trying to attract new settlers, new businesses. The territorial governor himself is considering a visit next spring. How do you think it looks to have a woman living in a hole in the ground like some kind of animal? Good for him. Mrs. Ashford, you must understand how this appears to normal people. Lenora set down her water bucket and turned to face him. Her dress was wet. Her hands were raw. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her face in gray strands. She looked nothing like the respectable widow the mayor wanted her to be. Mr. Pemberton, in 1879, I watched 47 people freeze to death because they had no shelter from a storm. My husband and my son were among them. They died close enough to safety that I could hear them calling my name. I have spent 3 years asking myself one question. What if the shelter had been ready? She pointed at the cave entrance behind her. This is my answer. A shelter that cannot burn. A shelter that cannot be blown down. A shelter that stays the same temperature year-round no matter what the weather does above ground. The mayor stared at her for a long moment. His face was red. His eyes were narrow. His hands were clenched at his sides. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, especially not by a woman. Especially not by a woman who lived in a cave. This town does not need crazy women digging holes. We need proper citizens who contribute to society in proper ways. Then I suppose I am not a proper citizen. Pemberton's face went even redder. I am warning you, Mrs. Ashford. If this embarrassment continues, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Will you arrest me for improving my own land? Will you take away property I purchased legally? The mayor had no answer for that. He turned and walked away without another word. Dr. Phineas Caldwell found her in town, not at her cave. She had come to trade furs for lamp oil at the general store. He was waiting for her on the porch when she came out. He was the only physician in Copper Ridge, a man of 62 with a medical degree from a university back east, and the kind of confidence that comes from decades of people trusting your judgment without question. He spoke gently, the way doctors speak to patients they have already diagnosed. Mrs. Ashford, I wonder if you might spare me a moment. Lenora looked around. She was standing in the middle of Main Street. People were watching from doorways and windows. The butcher had stopped sweeping his porch. The women at the dress shop had pressed their faces against the glass. The men at the saloon had come outside with their drinks in their hands. She understood immediately that this was not a private conversation. It was a performance. The town wanted to see the crazy woman examined in public. I have been asked by concerned citizens to evaluate your mental state. There is nothing wrong with my mental state, Dr. Caldwell. That is for me to determine. He opened his leather bag and removed a small notebook. He held a pencil in his other hand. He was ready to write down everything she said, ready to use her own words as evidence against her. Living underground is not natural. Medically speaking, it causes melancholia and lung disease. I have read studies written by people who have never survived a blizzard. The Earth stays at 54 degrees year-round. The air in a properly ventilated cave is cleaner than the air in any house. My father was a miner in Cornwall, England. He spent 40 years underground and lived to be 83. Dr. Caldwell paused with his pen above his notebook. He had clearly expected her to be confused, defensive, easy to dismiss. Instead, she was standing in the street reciting science with the calm precision of a lecturer. He closed his notebook without writing anything. He did not examine her. But the word he spread through town was the same word he would have written regardless of what she said. Mentally unbalanced. Someone should really do something about her. Prudence Pemberton arrived at the cave the following week. She was 48 years old, the mayor's wife, the most influential woman in Copper Ridge. She had a tongue sharp enough to flay skin and a talent for destroying reputations with a few well-chosen words. She brought two other women from the ladies' auxiliary. They carried parasols even though there was no sun. They wore their finest dresses even though they were visiting a cave. They had come to put on a show. Poor thing. She lost her mind when she lost her family. Someone really should commit her to an asylum for her own protection. Lenore was organizing her medical supplies, bandages and whiskey for disinfecting wounds, herbs she had gathered from the hillsides, the tools of healing she had learned to use during the war. She did not look up. "I am standing right here, Mrs. Pemberton. If you have something to say to me, you can say it directly. I am trying to help you. Surely you must realize how you appear to normal people. Living in a hole, talking to your dog, preparing for disasters that exist only in your imagination. The disaster that killed my husband was not imaginary. That was years ago, and it happened somewhere else. Nothing like that has ever happened in Copper Ridge." Lenora finally looked up. Her eyes were calm, her voice was steady, but there was something in her expression that made Prudence take a step backward. "Mrs. Pemberton, in 1873, a blizzard killed 200 people across Montana Territory. In 1876, another storm killed 84 in a single county. In 1880, a family of 7 froze to death 3 miles from this very town. Their cabin was buried under snow so deep no one found them until spring." The mayor's wife drew herself up. "I came here to offer you help, Mrs. Ashford. The Ladies' Auxiliary has discussed your situation. We are prepared to take up a collection to send you somewhere more appropriate. A sanitarium, perhaps?" Lenora smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Thank you for your concern. Now get out of my cave." The young men found entertainment in her misery. Emmett Tanner was 25 years old, the blacksmith's son, the leader of a group of young men who spent more time drinking and gambling than working. He had a loud laugh and a cruel streak that he mistook for wit. He made a public bet at the saloon one night that became the talk of the town. $5 says that cave collapses before Christmas. $10 says she freezes to death in there. $20 total wagered on the failure and death of a 50-year-old widow who had never done them any harm. And Reverend Ephraim Whitmore preached a sermon about her the following Sunday. Lenora did not attend church, but she heard about it from the only friend she had. "He called you a pagan, said that God put us above the earth, not beneath it like worms, said that burying yourself in stone is an abomination against the natural order." 6 people, the sheriff, the mayor, the doctor, the mayor's wife, a young gambler, a reverend. Every one of them told Lenora she was crazy. Every one of them had reasons that sounded perfectly sensible. Every one of them would be inside her way within 2 years, begging for the shelter they mocked. But we are not there yet. Chapter 3, The Daughter Who Believed. Not everyone in Copper Ridge was cruel. Some people looked at Lenora and saw something different. something that reminded them of truths they had learned the hard way, something that made them think about their own losses, their own fears, their own knowledge that the world could turn dangerous without warning. Cordelia Garrison was 45 years old, a practical woman who had buried two husbands and raised four children alone. She ran the bakery on Main Street with efficient hands and a no-nonsense attitude that discouraged foolishness. She did not care what anyone thought of her, which was perhaps why she was the first person in town willing to visit Lenora without mockery. She came on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a basket of fresh bread. The smell of it filled the cave entrance, warm and yeasty and alive. A smell that reminded Lenora of kitchens and families and all the ordinary things she had lost. Cordelia set the basket down on Lenora's makeshift table and looked around the cave with appraising eyes. "Why do you bring me bread? Everyone else in town thinks I am crazy." The baker shrugged. "I lost my first husband in a mining accident, lost my second to cholera. I know what it is like to lose everything and have people tell you to move on. Like grief is something you can pack up and put away when it becomes inconvenient for other people." She looked at the timber supports, the stockpiled supplies, the sleeping platforms Lenora had begun carving into the walls, the ventilation shafts that disappeared into the darkness of the ceiling. "You are not crazy, Lenora. You are preparing. I understand the difference." Well, it was the first time Lenora had smiled in months. Old Silas Brennan came on a cold evening in January of 1884. He was 78 years old and had lived in Montana Territory longer than most people had been alive. He walked with a cane and moved slowly, but his mind was sharp as a new blade. His eyes missed nothing, and his memory stretched back to times that most people had only heard about in stories. He stood at the cave entrance for a long time before speaking. His breath made clouds in the cold air. His cane tapped against the limestone. His white beard moved when he finally opened his mouth. "You are the Trelawney girl, are you not Cornelius Trelawney's daughter?" Lenora looked up from the fire she was building. She had not heard her father's name spoken aloud in years. It felt like being touched by a ghost. I married and became an Ashford." "How did you know my father?" "I worked with him in the Colorado silver mines back in '56. He talked about his daughter constantly. Said she was the smartest person he had ever met. Said she understood rock better than most men who had worked it their whole lives." The old man looked around the room, at the timber supports that held the ceiling firm, at the ventilation shafts that kept the air fresh, at the careful way everything had been positioned and reinforced, at the attention to detail that only someone who truly understood stone would notice. He was right. This is beautiful work. Lenora felt something shift in her chest, something she had not felt in years. Gratitude maybe, or recognition. The feeling of being seen by someone who understood what she was trying to do. "I remember the storm of '47, Silas said quietly. "Killed 200 people across the territory. I survived because I found a cave, just like you did. No one else remembers that storm. No one else was alive for it. But I was, and I have been watching you work for 2 years, wondering if anyone else in this town has the sense to listen to you. They do not." Silas nodded slowly. "They will eventually. People always listen when it is too late. But this time maybe it will not be too late. Because of you." He turned to leave, leaning heavily on his cane. "Keep building, Mrs. Ashford. When the storm comes, and it will come, you will be ready. And then they will understand." But the person who changed everything was Jessamine Hollister. She was 19 years old, a young widow with curious eyes and a stubborn chin. She was afraid of nothing, and she was the only person in Copper Ridge who sought out Lenora not from kindness or obligation, but from genuine interest. She came to the cave for the first time on a spring afternoon in 1883. Lenora was working on the ventilation system when she heard footsteps at the entrance. She expected another mockers, another concerned citizen, come to tell her she was embarrassing the town. Instead, she found a young woman with her hands clasped in front of her and a look of determination on her face. "Mrs. Ashford, my name is Jessamine Hollister." "May I come in?" Lenora set down her tools and studied the girl. She was young, far too young to be visiting the town madwoman, far too young to be risking her reputation on association with someone everyone else avoided. "Why would you want to?" "Because my mother died in a house fire when I was 12. The house was well built. The stove was properly maintained. Everything was done correctly, and she still died. I learned that day that being normal does not protect you from disaster. Only being prepared does. Lenora was silent for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Come in. Jessamine came nearly every week after that. She asked questions about limestone, about ventilation, about the properties of underground springs, about the way temperature remained constant no matter what the weather did above ground, about the techniques Lenora's father had learned in the mines of Cornwall, about the science of survival that most people never thought about until it was too late. She was hungry for knowledge in a way that Lenora had rarely seen. She listened carefully to every answer. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was actually thinking about what she heard. She was not humoring the town madwoman. She was learning from her. Does it bother you, Jessamine asked one afternoon? Knowing they are betting on your death, Lenora was teaching the girl how to identify the strongest sections of rock, how to spot the places where water had made it weak, how to read the stone the way her father had taught her to read it. It bothers me that they are wasting money they could use to prepare for winter. You really believe a bad storm is coming. A bad storm is always coming. That is what people do not understand. They think because last winter was mild, this winter will be mild too. They think because nothing bad has happened to them yet, nothing bad ever will. Jessamine looked around the cave, at the work that had consumed 2 years of Lenora's life, at the sleeping platforms that could hold dozens of people, at the supply rooms filled with enough food to last weeks, at the medical station where wounds could be treated and lives could be saved. My father thinks you are crazy. Most people do. I do not think you are crazy. I think you are the smartest person in this town. Why do you come here, Jessamine? Why do you risk your reputation being seen with the town madwoman? The girl was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant, remembering something that still hurt after 7 years. Because I watched my mother burn, I watched the house collapse around her, I watched everything I loved turn to ash. And I swore that day that I would never be helpless again, that I would learn everything I could about how to survive, that I would never let anyone I loved die because I was not prepared. Lenora stopped working and looked at the young woman, really looked at her. She saw herself at that age, the same determination, the same refusal to accept the world as it was, the same hunger for knowledge that could make a difference. She saw the daughter she had never had. If a storm comes, you bring your family here. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Just come. I will. I promise. It was Jessamine who finally heard the truth about Ezra and Josiah. They were sitting by the fire in the main chamber one evening in late autumn. The first snow of the season had fallen that morning, a light dusting that would melt by afternoon. Nothing dangerous, nothing deadly. But it had made Lenora quiet. My husband's name was Ezra. My son's name was Josiah. He was 16 when he died. Jessamine did not speak. She simply listened. The storm came without warning. They were gathering firewood, 30 feet from the wagon. I heard them calling my name for 20 minutes. I tried to reach them. I crawled on my hands and knees through snow so thick I could not see my own hand in front of my face, but I could not find them. Lenora's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I found a crack in the limestone, a narrow opening. I crawled inside and the wind stopped. The cold stopped. The dying stopped. I survived because the earth protected me. And Ezra and Josiah, I found them on the 4th day. After the storm broke, they were lying together in the snow. Ezra's arm was around Josiah's shoulders. They were facing the crack in the limestone. Their hands were reaching toward it, 15 feet. Lenora nodded. 15 feet. Close enough that if Ezra had reached out his arm, his fingertips might have brushed the rock. Close enough that in the silence between gusts of wind they might have heard me breathing. Close enough that I will never stop wondering if I could have saved them. If I had called louder. If I had crawled faster. If I had done something different. Jessamine reached out and took Lenora's hand. You could not have saved them. The storm would have killed you too. I know, but knowing does not make it easier. Nothing makes it easier. Nothing except this. She gestured at the cave around them. This is how I honor them. This is how I make their deaths mean something. If I can save even one person, if I can make sure no one else ever falls short by 15 feet, then maybe I can live with what happened. Jessamine squeezed her hand. You will save more than one person. I believe that. And in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding that went beyond words. A connection that felt like family. The older woman who had lost her son. The younger woman who had lost her mother. Two people who had been broken by the world and had chosen to build something instead of falling apart. Lenore had found a daughter. Jessamine had found a mother. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them knew there was one more truth that needed to be told. It came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Virgil Cranston rode out to the cave on a gray afternoon in December of 1883. The sky was heavy with clouds that promised snow. The wind had a bite to it that spoke of the cold to come. He did not mock her this time. He dismounted from his horse and stood at the entrance of the cave with his hat in his hands. His face was drawn, his eyes were haunted. He looked like a man who had been carrying a weight for too long and could not bear it anymore. I need to tell you something. Lenore set down her tools and waited. She had not spoken to Virgil in months, not since that first day when he had told her that Ezra would be ashamed. She had nothing to say to him, nothing she wanted to hear. But there was something in his face that made her listen. Ezra asked me to join the wagon train. Before you left Missouri, he came to my house and asked me to come with you to Montana. Said there was land to be claimed, a future to be built, a life better than anything we had in the cavalry. Lenore felt something cold settle in her stomach. Why are you telling me this? Because I said no. I was too comfortable here. Too safe. I had my house, my routine. I did not want to risk it all on a dream of something better. Virgil's voice cracked. When I heard that Ezra died in that storm, I was relieved. Relieved that it was him and not me. Relieved that I had stayed safe while he took the risk and paid the price. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. Every time I saw you, I saw him. I saw the friend I abandoned. I saw the man who asked for my help and got nothing but excuses. So I mocked you. I tried to drive you away because it was easier than facing my own guilt, easier than admitting that I was a coward, easier than looking at you and knowing that I could have been there, that maybe if I had been there, things would have been different. Ed. Lenore was silent for a long time. The wind howled outside the cave. Copper lay by the fire, his ears twitching at the sounds of the approaching storm. Somewhere in the darkness of the passages, water dripped from limestone formations that had taken thousands of years to form. She thought about Ezra, about his gentle eyes and his steady hands, and the way he had always believed the best about people, even the people who did not deserve it. She thought about what he would say if he were here. She thought about forgiveness. Guilt is a heavy burden. I carried it for years after the storm. I wondered why I survived when they did not. I wondered if I could have been faster, stronger, braver. I wondered if their deaths were my fault. How did you let it go? I did not let it go. I transformed it. I built something with my guilt instead of drowning in it. You can do the same. How? By living, by helping others, by being the man Ezra believed you could be. Virgil stood there for a long moment. The tears on his face caught the firelight. His hands trembled as he put his hat back on his head. He looked older than his 55 years. He looked broken. He looked like a man who had finally told the truth after years of lying to himself. I do not know if I can be that man. Neither do I. But you can try. And when the storm comes, you can help save lives instead of betting against them. She turned back to her work. Behind her, she heard Virgil mount his horse and ride away into the approaching darkness. She did not know if he would ever come back. She did not know if he would ever change. But she had told him the truth. And sometimes that was all you could do. By the summer of 1883, Lenore had transformed the cave system into something remarkable. The main chamber was 40 feet deep, 25 feet wide, and 12 feet high. She had reinforced every wall with timber supports hauled from mountains 20 miles away. Each beam weighed 200 pounds. She had dragged them on a makeshift sled one at a time over 20 miles of rough terrain. Her hands had been raw for months. Her shoulders ached constantly. Her back had not stopped hurting since the first year. But she never stopped. She had smoothed the floor so that elderly people and children could walk without stumbling. This alone had taken 6 months of work, on her hands and knees with a chisel and hammer, breaking away rough limestone until the surface was flat and safe. She had worn through 3 pairs of gloves. She had broken 4 chisels. She had carved niches into the walls for oil lamps that provided steady light without the smoke of torches. Each niche was precisely positioned to maximize illumination while minimizing shadows. She had tested dozens of configurations before finding the arrangement that worked best. Behind the main chamber, she had discovered and expanded a network of connecting caves, a storage chamber filled with dried meat, flour beans, and preserved vegetables, enough food for 50 people for 3 weeks, a room with access to the underground spring that ran clear and cold year-round, water that would never freeze, water that would never run dry, a sleeping area with 12 wooden platforms covered in straw and wool blankets, room for families, room for children, room for the elderly and the sick. A smaller chamber she had set up as a medical station, stocked with bandages, whiskey for disinfecting wounds, herbs she had learned to use as an army nurse. The tools to save lives when lives needed saving. But the crown of her work was the ventilation system. Using techniques her father had described from the Cornish mines, she had created two shafts that rose through natural cracks in the limestone to the surface above. One shaft drew fresh air in, the other allowed smoke from cook fires to rise out. The system worked so well that even with a fire burning in the main chamber, the air stayed clean and breathable. No smoke accumulated, no fumes built up. The cave breathed the way a living thing breathes. She had spent every dollar she had. She had worked every day for 2 years until her hands bled and her muscles screamed. She had done everything alone, with only Copper for company. The old dog would sit at the cave entrance while she worked, watching her with patient brown eyes, his tail thumping against the stone floor whenever she spoke to him. And now she was ready. The shelter could hold 50 people. It had supplies for 3 weeks. It had water that would never freeze. It had warmth that required almost no fuel because the earth itself provided insulation. 54 degrees, summer and winter alike, just as her father had promised. All she needed now was for people to believe her. They did not, but she kept building anyway. Because she knew what was coming, she could feel it in her bones. The storm was coming, and when it arrived she would be ready, even if no one else was. The morning of February 9th, 1884 dawned cold but clear. Lenora woke before sunrise, as she always did. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, and she added fresh wood before the chill could settle too deep into the main chamber. Copper lay on his blanket near the fire, watching her with sleepy brown eyes. She fed him dried meat from the supply stores. She checked the water levels in the containers she kept filled from the underground spring. She reviewed her inventory of blankets and bandages and preserved food. Everything was ready. Everything had been ready for months. She prepared to walk her trap lines. The traps she had set in the hills provided meat and furs that she could trade in town for the few supplies she could not make herself. Lamp oil, salt, the occasional luxury like coffee or sugar. But something felt wrong. Copper would not leave the cave. The dog had been with her for 5 years. He had followed her through everything, through grief and wandering, through 2 years of backbreaking work in the darkness of a cave that everyone said would kill her. He had never once refused to accompany her anywhere. But this morning he planted himself at the cave entrance and would not move. His ears were flat against his head. His eyes were fixed on the northern horizon. His tail was tucked between his legs. Every muscle in his body was tense. When Lenora knelt beside him and asked what was wrong, he whined. A low, mournful sound that she had heard only once before, in March of 1879, 3 hours before the storm that killed her family. Lenora went back inside the cave and began making preparations. By noon, she knew she had been right to listen to the dog. The pressure in her head changed, a dull ache behind her eyes that she had felt only a few times in her life, the kind of ache that meant the weather was about to do something violent. The birds that usually sang in the scrub pines around her property had gone silent. Not quiet, silent, as if every living thing with wings had simply vanished, as if they had all received some signal that humans could not hear and had fled to wherever birds go when death is coming. When Lenora walked to the edge of her property and looked north, she saw the clouds building on the horizon. Not white clouds, not gray clouds, yellow clouds, the color of sulfur, the color of sickness, the color of something ancient and hungry gathering its strength. She had seen clouds like that only once before, in March of 1879. 3 hours before the storm that killed Ezra and Josiah. Lenora ran to town. She went to Mayor Aldrich Pemberton first. He was in his office at the bank reviewing ledgers and drinking coffee from a china cup that probably cost more than most families in Copper Ridge earned in a month. He looked up with irritation when she burst through the door without knocking. "Mrs. Ashford, I believe I made myself clear about my feelings regarding your presence in this establishment. There is a major storm coming within hours. It will be the worst this territory has ever seen. And how exactly do you know this? The pressure is dropping. The birds have gone silent. The clouds on the northern horizon are the color of sulfur. These are signs my father taught me to recognize. Signs I saw before the storm that killed my husband." Pemberton set down his coffee cup. His face arranged itself into an expression of patient condescension, the expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone too simple to understand. "Mrs. Ashford, we have weather every day. We do not panic about it. This is not weather. This is a killer storm. People need to prepare. They need to stock extra firewood. They need to secure their livestock. They need to know where my cave is so they can find shelter if their homes fail. And I suppose you want everyone to come running to your cave. Is that what this is? A scheme to make yourself important? A way to force people to acknowledge your madness? This is a scheme to keep people alive." Pemberton stood up from his desk. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself as if he were. He walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of Lenora, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that she could see the contempt in his eyes. "Go back to your hole, Mrs. Ashford. Stop scaring people with your delusions. This town has had enough of your nonsense." Lenora stared at him for a long moment. Then she spoke slowly and clearly, as if she were carving the words into stone. "The cave is 2 miles east of town, past the dead oak tree. The entrance is between two limestone slabs. I have marked it with a red cloth. If you need shelter, come there. The door will be open." She turned and left. Sheriff Virgil Cranston was standing outside the bank. He had been listening through the open window. His face was pale. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked like a man who had just heard something he did not want to believe. "Lenora, you need to stop this. People are already talking about having you committed." "Virgil, do you remember the storm that killed Ezra?" The sheriff's face tightened. "Of course I remember." "Do you remember the signs before it hit the yellow sky? The pressure change, the silence of the birds?" He did not answer. "I'm seeing those signs right now. Today. This afternoon. I am telling you as someone who survived that storm that the same thing is about to happen here. Maybe worse." Virgil shook his head slowly. His eyes would not meet hers. His badge caught the weak winter sunlight. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, as if he was not sure whether Lenora was a threat or a victim. "Go back to your cave, Lenora." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that made his face go white as snow. "Ezra called your name when he was lost in the blizzard. He called for you. I heard him. In those 20 minutes when I could hear their voices but could not reach them. He called for you to help him. That is not fair." "No, it is not. Nothing about any of this is fair, but I am giving you a chance to do something, to help people instead of laughing at them. 2 miles east, past the dead oak. Look for the red cloth." She walked away. Behind her, Virgil Cranston stood frozen in the street, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except remember the friend he had abandoned and the guilt he had carried for 5 years. Lenora tried Dr. Phineas Caldwell next. He listened politely while she described the signs, the pressure change, the yellow clouds, the silent birds, the feeling in her bones that something terrible was coming. When she finished, he reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small bottle. "This is a mild sedative. It will help calm your nerves. I recommend you take 1 dose now and another before bed. These episodes of anxiety are common in women of your age. Nothing to be ashamed of." Lenora left the bottle on his desk. She tried Reverend Ephraim Whitmore. The preacher was in his church preparing for the Sunday sermon he would never get to deliver. He listened to her warning with his hands folded and his eyes closed. When she finished, he opened his eyes and smiled. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Ashford, but we will trust in God's protection. The Lord watches over his flock. He will shelter us from any storm. God helps those who help themselves, Reverend. That cave is 2 miles east. The door will be open." The church has stood for 15 years. It will stand for 15 more. Go in peace, Mrs. Ashford, and pray for guidance. She tried 6 more families. Some listened politely. Some barely let her speak before shutting doors in her face. The Hendersons said they would consider what she had told them. The Brennans, Irish immigrants who lived on the edge of town and were looked down upon by everyone else, actually seemed to believe her. A few openly mocked her, old crazy Lenora, predicting the end of the world again. Someone should really do something about her. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, exhausted and frustrated, Lenora headed back to the cave. She had done everything she could. She had warned everyone she could find. Not one of them had listened. In 3 hours, every one of them would wish they had. Lenora spent that final hour checking everything twice. She stacked extra firewood near the main chamber, enough to burn for 2 weeks if necessary. She filled every container she had with water from the underground spring. She laid out blankets and on the sleeping platforms. She placed oil lamps in each niche along the walls and made sure every one of them was full and ready to light. She checked the ventilation shafts one last time. She tested the timber supports by pressing against them with all her weight. She walked through every chamber and every passage, making sure nothing had been forgotten. Then she sat at the entrance with Copper beside her and watched the yellow clouds swallow the northern sky. The dog pressed against her leg. He whined, "I know, boy, I know." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the storm arrived. The blizzard hit Copper Ridge with a violence that no one had ever seen. Within 22 minutes, the temperature dropped 40 degrees, from 28 above zero to 12 below. A drop so sudden and so severe that it was like stepping from a warm room into an ice house. The wind went from a gentle breeze to 65 miles per hour in less than 10 minutes. It came screaming from the north like the breath of something ancient and furious. Like the world itself was trying to scour everything clean. Like God had decided to erase Copper Ridge from the face of the earth. The sky did not darken slowly the way storms usually announce themselves. It changed all at once, like someone had blown out every lantern in heaven. One moment the weak winter sun was shining on the snow-covered rooftops of the small Montana Territory town. The next moment the world turned the color of old bruises, yellow and black and sick. The snow did not fall, it came from everywhere at once, pouring through the streets like floodwater made of ice, finding every gap in every wall, every crack beneath every door, every weakness in every building that the people of Copper Ridge had thought was solid. Within minutes, the insides of houses began to turn white. Fine powder snow forced its way through seams that had held for years, through windows that had never leaked before, through walls that had seemed impenetrable. People who were standing outside when the storm hit said later that it felt like being struck by something solid. One moment they could see their surroundings clearly. The next moment they were blind, unable to see their own hands in front of their faces, unable to tell which direction they were facing, unable to do anything except try to survive. The cold came so fast that exposed skin began to freeze within minutes. Fingers went numb, then painful, then numb again in a way that meant the tissue was dying. Lungs burned with every breath as the frozen air scraped through them like sandpaper made of ice crystals. This was not weather. This was war. And the people of Copper Ridge were losing. Chapter 5, The Beggars at the Door. The first person to reach Lenora's cave was Jessamine Hollister. She had been at home with her parents and younger brother when the storm hit. The roof of their house was well built. The walls were solid. The stove was burning hot. But the chimney cracked under the force of the wind. The crack was small at first, just a thin line in the mortar between the stones. But the wind found it. The cold found it. And within minutes, smoke began filling every room. "We have to go." Jessamine's father shook his head. He was a practical man, a careful man, a man who did not take unnecessary risks. "We cannot go outside. We will die in seconds. We will die here too if the house fills with smoke. I know where to go. Mrs. Ashford's cave. She told me the way. 2 miles east, past the dead oak tree, look for the gap between 2 limestone slabs." Her father stared at her. "That crazy woman. You want us to trust our lives to a hole in the ground. I want us to trust our lives to the only shelter that can survive this storm. We can make it if we go now. If we wait, the smoke will kill us. If we stay, the cold will kill us. Either way, we die." The family argued for 5 minutes. Then a gust of wind shattered a window. Glass exploded into the room. Snow poured through the opening like water through a broken dam. The temperature inside the house dropped 10 degrees in seconds. The argument was over. They wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they could find. Coats over coats, scarves over scarves, gloves and mittens, and anything else that might keep the cold from reaching their skin. Jessamine found rope in the barn. She tied it around her waist, then around her father's waist, then around her mother's waist, then around her brother's waist. They would not get separated. They would not lose each other the way Lenora had lost Ezra and Josiah. Jessamine led the way. She kept the wind on her left shoulder. She moved east, step by step, foot by foot, through snow that was already waist deep and getting deeper, through wind that knocked her down again and again, through cold that bit through every layer of clothing and tried to reach her bones. The walk that normally took 20 minutes took an hour of blindness, an hour of cold so intense that Jessamine could feel her fingers dying inside her gloves, an hour of wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, if she was leading her family to their deaths instead of to safety. But she found it, the gap between two limestone slabs, the red cloth frozen stiff but still visible against the white. The entrance to the place the whole town had laughed about for 2 years. Jessamine pushed through the narrow opening and felt the temperature change immediately. The wind that had been trying to kill her was suddenly gone. The snow that had been blinding her was suddenly absent. The cold that had been stealing her life was suddenly bearable. The silence was shocking after the screaming of the storm. Lenora was waiting with blankets and hot coffee. "I knew you would come. My father did not believe me. But here we are. Get warm. There will be others." They came in ones and twos and families. Cordelia Garrison arrived 30 minutes after the Hollisters. Half frozen, her face white with cold, her fingers so numb she could barely move them. But she had not let go of the 3 loaves of bread she had grabbed from her bakery before running. "I thought you might need these." Lenora wrapped her in blankets and sat her by the fire. Old Silas Brennan appeared an hour later, moving slowly but steadily. The way he did everything, he had walked 2 miles through the blizzard using nothing but his cane and his memory of the land. "I knew the way from 47. The storm felt the same. I knew where to go." Lenora helped him to a sleeping platform and covered him with wool blankets. The Henderson family came next, a mother, a father, and 3 children under the age of 10. Their cabin had started to shake so violently that they feared it would collapse. The walls were groaning, the roof was lifting, everything was coming apart. "We remembered what you said about the cave. I did not believe you, but my wife did. She made us come. Get your children warm. There is food and water. You are safe now." Dr. Phineas Caldwell arrived, carried by 2 young men who had found him collapsed in a barn with a broken leg. His horse had panicked in the wind and thrown him. He had felt something crack when he hit the frozen ground. He could not walk. He could not stand. He could not even crawl. He had dragged himself to a barn using only his arms. He had lain in the straw next to 2 terrified horses for 3 hours. He had been certain he was going to die. Then 2 men had found him, strangers who had been trying to make their way to the cave. They had picked him up and carried him the rest of the way. When Lenora knelt beside him and began examining his leg, his eyes focused. "Mrs. Ashford, I was wrong. The pressure change. The birds. You were right. About everything. We can discuss that later. Right now you need to be still while I set this leg." The Brennan family arrived in a group of 6, Silas's cousins from Ireland. Poor immigrants who had settled on the edge of town and been looked down upon by everyone else in Copper Ridge. They had no money, no status, no connections. But they had listened when Lenora warned them about the storm. They had not hesitated. They had come. "Thank you," the mother said through chattering teeth. "Thank you for saving my children." Lenora wrapped them all in blankets and gave them hot coffee and said nothing about how the rest of the town had treated them. Nothing about the prejudice they had faced. Nothing about the cruelty of a community that had made them feel unwelcome. They were here now. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Emmett Tanner arrived with frostbite on his hands and tears frozen on his face. The young man who had once bet $5 on Lenora's death was now standing in the gap between the limestone slabs, shaking, terrified, humbled. He had been in the saloon when the storm arrived. He had tried to run the 50 yards to his father's blacksmith shop. 50 yards, a distance he could cover in seconds on a normal day. He got lost after 10 feet. The blowing snow turned him around so completely that he could not tell which direction he was facing. He wandered in circles for 20 minutes, growing colder and colder, his hands going numb, his ears burning, his lungs screaming with every breath. He had walked directly into a wall. He had followed that wall with his frozen fingers. He had found a door. He had pounded until someone let him in. It was not his father's shop. It was a stranger's house. But he was alive. He had waited there for 2 hours. Then he had remembered the crazy woman and her cave, the shelter everyone laughed about, the hole in the ground that might be the only thing left standing. He had wrapped himself in everything he could find and started walking east. I was wrong. I was a fool. Please, please let me in. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had laughed loudest at the saloon, the man who had encouraged others to mock her, the man who had wagered money on her death. She could have turned him away. She could have reminded him of every cruel word. She could have made him beg longer. Instead, she stepped aside. Come in. Get warm. By nightfall, 21 people were sheltered in Lenora's cave. The storm raged outside. The wind screamed through the mountains. The snow piled higher and higher until it buried the entrance to the cave, and Lenora had to dig a tunnel just to see the sky. But inside they were safe, warm, fed. The supplies Lenora had stockpiled for 2 years were enough for the group. The fire burned steadily while the ventilation system kept the air clean. The temperature held at 54 degrees while the world outside dropped to 40 below zero. And then just after midnight, someone pounded on the entrance. Lenora grabbed a lantern and went to see who it was. She found Sheriff Virgil Cranston collapsed in the gap between the limestone slabs. He was barely conscious. His face was white with frostbite. His hands were frozen into claws that could no longer open or close. His lips were blue and his breathing was shallow. And he had a child in his arms. A little girl no more than 5 years old, wrapped in his coat, her face pressed against his chest, her small body shivering violently. Her name was Rosie, the daughter of a family that lived on the far edge of town. Virgil had been riding to check on outlying farms when the blizzard hit. He had found Rosie wandering in the snow, crying for her mama, already showing signs of frostbite, already close to death. Her parents had tried to make it from their farm to town. They had died within 100 yards of their door, frozen where they fell, their bodies already buried under feet of snow. Virgil had picked up the child and started walking. 4 hours. 4 hours of wind so strong it knocked him down repeatedly. 4 hours of cold so intense that his fingers had stopped moving and his ears had turned gray. 4 hours of holding a crying child against his chest and telling her they were almost there. Almost safe, just a little farther. Found her in the snow. Her parents are dead. Could not leave her. Could not leave her the way I left Ezra. Lenora looked at the man who had mocked her for 2 years. The man who had told her that Ezra would be ashamed. The man who had stood by while others tried to have her committed to an asylum. The man who had carried his guilt like a stone around his neck for 5 years. He had walked through a killing storm for 4 hours to save a child who was not his own. His hands would never be the same. 2 of his fingers were black. They would have to come off. His ears were gray. His nose had patches of dead white skin. He had given pieces of himself to save a little girl. Help me, Lenora shouted into the cave. I need help here now. She worked on them through the night. Rosie was easier. Children are resilient. Their bodies recover from cold faster than adults. Her hands and feet were red and swollen, but there was no deep tissue damage. She would recover fully. Virgil was worse. Lenora had seen frostbite during the war. She knew what it looked like when someone was going to lose parts of themselves. She knew the black color that meant dead tissue. She knew the gray color that meant dying tissue. She knew the white color that meant the battle was already lost. Am I going to lose them? Virgil whispered, looking at his blackened fingers. Not if I can help it. She worked through the night, warming his hands slowly, never too fast. Fast warming caused more damage than the cold itself. She wrapped them in wool and changed the wrappings every hour. She gave him whiskey for the pain and made him drink hot broth to warm him from inside. And she talked to him. Not about his hands, about Ezra. I deserve this. What I said to you, what I did. Nobody deserves to freeze to death. The sheriff was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Somewhere deeper in the cave, a child was crying softly. Then he spoke again. When I heard about Ezra dying in that storm, I was relieved. Lenora's hands paused on his bandages, relieved that it was him and not me. He had asked me to come with you, to join the wagon train. He said Montana was full of opportunity. He said we could build something together, the way we used to talk about during the war. Why did you say no? Because I was comfortable, safe. I had my job, my house, my routine. I did not want to risk it all on a dream. Virgil closed his eyes. Tears leaked from beneath his frozen lids. Every time I saw you, I saw him. I saw the friend I abandoned, the friend I could have saved if I had been there. So I mocked you. I tried to drive you away. It was easier than facing my own guilt. Lenora was quiet for a long time. The cave was still except for the sound of breathing and the distant howl of the wind beyond the limestone walls. 21 people slept around her. 21 lives that depended on the shelter she had built. Then she dipped her cloth in warm water and continued cleaning his wounds. Guilt is a heavy burden. I carried it for years after the storm. I wondered why I survived when they did not. I wondered if I could have been faster, stronger, braver. I wondered if their deaths were my fault. How did you let it go? I did not let it go. I transformed it. I built something with my guilt instead of drowning in it. You can do the same. How? By living, by helping others, by being the man Ezra believed you could be. She finished wrapping his hands and pulled a blanket over him. Now rest. We have a long way to go before this storm is over. 27 people. That was the final count after the first night. 27 people huddled inside a limestone cave that the entire town had spent 2 years calling the Mad Woman's Hole. 27 people who had laughed and mocked and bet money on failure. 27 people who were now alive because one woman had refused to stop building. Lenore organized them like the army nurse she had been. She assigned sleeping areas, families in the side chambers where they could have privacy. Single people in the main room where they could share warmth. The elderly and the injured closest to the fire. She established a cooking rotation with Cordelia in charge of preparing meals from the stockpiled supplies. Cordelia had run a bakery for 15 years. She knew how to stretch ingredients. She knew how to make food last. She set up a schedule for tending the fires and monitoring the ventilation shafts. The fires needed to burn constantly to keep the temperature comfortable. The ventilation shafts needed to be checked for blockages caused by drifting snow. She put Dr. Caldwell in charge of health despite his injured leg. He had medical training, even if he had been wrong about everything else. Even if he had offered her sedatives when she tried to warn him. He was still a doctor, and she kept Copper by her side at all times. The old dog seemed to sense that something important was happening. He moved among the refugees like a four-legged nurse, letting children pet him, sitting beside people who were crying, resting his chin on the knees of anyone who seemed to need comfort. He did the work that no human could do. He gave warmth without judgment, companionship without words. On the third day, the supplies began to run low. 27 people consumed far more food and water than Lenore had planned for. She had prepared for 50 people for 3 weeks, but the pace of consumption was faster than she had expected. Children needed more. People recovering from frostbite needed more. Fear and cold made everyone hungry. Prudence Pemberton noticed first. The mayor's wife had arrived on the second day. Rescued by her husband's servants after the general store where she had been shopping became uninhabitable. She had brought nothing with her except complaints. The portions are getting smaller. We are running out of food. We are all going to starve in this hole. The cave fell silent. 26 pairs of eyes turned to Lenora. We are not running out. We are adjusting to make sure we have enough for the duration of the storm. And how long will that be? Days, weeks? We cannot live on dried meat and beans forever. You can live on dried meat and beans for as long as necessary. It is better than freezing to death. Prudence's face reddened. This is unacceptable. You have no right to ration our food. We are free citizens, not prisoners. Lenora's voice did not change. It stayed calm and steady and quiet. But every person in that cave heard what she said next. You are guests in my home. If you do not like how I run it, you are welcome to leave. She gestured toward the cave entrance, toward the gap in the limestone where the wind screamed and the snow flew past like white fire. The door is right there. Prudence opened her mouth to argue. Then she closed it. She sat down and ate her reduced portion in silence. On the fourth day, Lenora gathered everyone in the main chamber. She led them through a narrow passage that most of them had not noticed, a passage that looked like nothing special, just another crack in the limestone, just another shadow in the darkness. But behind that passage was a second storage chamber, filled with food, filled with supplies, enough to feed 50 people for another 2 weeks. I prepared this separately, in case the first supplies were compromised, in case more people came than expected, in case the storm lasted longer than anyone could imagine. Old Silas Brennan stared at her. You prepared for us. You knew we would come. I prepared for anyone who needed it. I could not save my family, but I could save whoever came next. The mood in the cave shifted after that. People who had mocked Lenora for 2 years began to look at her differently, not as a crazy woman, not as an embarrassment, not as someone who needed to be committed to an asylum, but as someone who had thought ahead when no one else would, someone who had sacrificed everything to prepare for a disaster that everyone else refused to believe could happen, someone who had saved all their lives. Days passed in the darkness of the cave. The storm continued to rage outside. The wind continued to scream. The snow continued to pile higher and higher until it buried the world. Inside, 27 people learned to live together. They learned each other's names. They learned each other's stories. They learned the small kindnesses that make survival possible. A shared blanket, a word of encouragement, a moment of silence for someone who was struggling. They learned that the crazy woman was not crazy at all. She was prepared, and that made all the difference. On the fifth day, the real test came, not from the storm outside, from inside the cave. Jessamine Hollister had been quiet for 2 days. She moved slowly. She ate little. Her mother hovered near her with obvious worry. Lenora pulled the mother aside. How far along is she? The mother's eyes went wide. How did you know I was an army nurse? I have seen it before. How far? 7 months. Her husband Thomas was a miner. He died in a tunnel collapse last summer. 2 weeks after their wedding. We did not tell anyone about the pregnancy. We were ashamed. Lenora nodded slowly. There is nothing to be ashamed of, but there is something to be worried about. What do you mean she is in labor? It started this morning, and the baby is coming too early. 7 months. Too early for safety, too early for certainty, too early for anything except hope. And in a cave in the middle of the worst blizzard Montana had ever seen, hope was the only thing they had. Lenora had delivered babies during the war, soldiers' wives who followed the army from camp to camp followers who had nowhere else to go, women who gave birth in tents while cannons thundered in the distance and men screamed and died in the fields beyond. She knew what to do. She also knew that 7-month babies rarely survived. Get her to the medical chamber. Boil water. Bring clean cloths. All the blankets you can find. Jessamine's mother moved quickly. Fear gave her speed. Love gave her purpose. Within minutes, the small chamber that Lenore had set up as a medical station was ready. Jessamine lay on the wooden platform that served as a bed. Her face was pale. Her breathing was shallow. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the constant 54-degree temperature of the cave. She was scared. Lenora could see it in her eyes. The fear of a young woman who had already lost so much. Her mother to fire, her husband to a mining accident, and now she was about to bring a child into the world 2 months too early. In a cave, in the middle of the worst storm anyone had ever seen. I am going to die. Aren't I? Lenora took her hand. No, you are not going to die. I did not build this cave to let people die in it. You are going to have this baby, and you are going to live to watch her grow up. Her Lenora smiled. Call it a feeling. Dr. Caldwell hobbled into the chamber on his makeshift crutch. His leg was splinted and wrapped in bandages. He could barely stand, but he had delivered hundreds of babies in his career. He knew what to do. Together they worked. 3 hours. 3 hours of labor in a limestone cave while a blizzard raged outside. 3 hours of pain and fear and hope. 3 hours of two people who had been enemies working side by side to bring a new life into the world. Lenora held Jessamine's hand through the worst of it. She talked to her constantly, told her stories about Ezra and Josiah, about the life they had dreamed of building in Montana, about the cave and why she had built it, about the father who had taught her everything she knew about stone and survival. She talked to keep Jessamine focused, to give her something to hold on to besides the pain. And when the moment came, Lenora was ready. The baby was small, smaller than any infant Lenora had ever seen. She fit in the palm of one hand. Her skin was thin and red. Her fingers were like tiny twigs. Her eyes were closed, and she was not breathing. Lenora cleared the airway. She rubbed the tiny chest with gentle fingers. She did everything she had learned during the war, everything the surgeons had taught her about bringing life back to bodies that had given up. Nothing happened. The baby lay still in her hands, silent, motionless. A tiny life that had fought so hard to enter the world and then stop fighting. Dr. Caldwell shook his head. Jessamine was crying. Her mother was praying. Lenora did not give up. She remembered something a surgeon had told her during the war, a technique he had learned from a doctor in Europe, a way to breathe life into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. She lowered her face to the tiny mouth and nose. She breathed gently, softly, as if she could will the life into this child by the tenderness of her breath alone. One breath, nothing. Two breaths, nothing. The silence in the chamber was absolute. 25 people had gathered at the entrance. They stood in the shadows, watching, waiting, hoping. 3 breaths, nothing. Lenora kept breathing. She would not stop. She would not give up. She had built this cave to save lives. She had spent 2 years bleeding and sweating and crying so that people would not die. This baby was not going to die, not here, not now, not while Lenora still had breath in her own lungs to give. 4 breaths. The baby coughed, a tiny sound, like a kitten sneezing. Barely audible, but Lenora heard it. She felt the small chest move beneath her fingers. 5 breaths. The baby coughed again, and then she wailed. It was the most beautiful sound Lenora had ever heard. A thin, high cry that cut through the silence of the cave and reached every person in every chamber. 25 people heard that cry and knew that something extraordinary had happened. A miracle. Born in the darkness of a cave while the world outside tried to kill everyone in it. Lenora wrapped the baby in warm blankets. She placed her on Jessamine's chest. Mother and daughter, alive. Together. What will you name her, Jessamine? Looked at the tiny face, at the eyes that were starting to open, at the fingers that were reaching for something to hold. Hope. I want to name her Hope. Lenora felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been frozen for 5 years began to thaw. Ice that she had not even known was there started to melt. She had built this cave because Ezra and Josiah had died 15 feet from safety. She had spent 2 years being mocked and ridiculed and called crazy. She had sacrificed everything she had to create a shelter that could save lives. And now a baby named Hope was crying in a cave in Montana. A baby who would not exist if Lenora had listened to the people who told her to stop. A baby who would not be breathing if Lenora had given up. Ezra and Josiah had not died for nothing. Their deaths had meaning now. They had meaning because a baby named Hope was alive. The storm raged for 4 more days. The wind screamed, the snow fell. The temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there. The world beyond the limestone walls was death, pure and simple and absolute. But inside the cave, life continued. Cordelia baked bread using the flour from Lenora's stores. The smell of it filled the chambers and made people smile. It reminded them of kitchens and homes and all the ordinary things they had taken for granted. Old Silas told stories about the old days, about the storms of 1847 and 1853, about the miners who had survived by knowing when to stay underground, about the wisdom that came from listening to the earth instead of fighting it. The children played games in the main chamber, tag and hide and seek, and made up games with rules that changed every few minutes. Their laughter echoed off the limestone walls, a sound that seemed impossible given what was happening outside. Dr. Caldwell examined everyone daily, checking for frostbite, checking for fever, checking for any sign that the close quarters and the stress were taking a toll. His leg was healing slowly. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk. Sheriff Virgil held little Rosie on his lap for hours at a time. The girl had lost her parents. She had no one left in the world except the man who had carried her through a blizzard. She clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to chaos. She called him Papa. The first time she said it, Virgil cried, and Jessamine nursed baby Hope and watched her daughter grow stronger day by day. The baby was small, too small, but she was fighting, she was surviving. She was proving that life could triumph over death, even in the darkest circumstances. On the eighth day, the wind began to die. Not completely, not safely, but the constant screaming that had filled their world for over a week became intermittent. There were moments of silence now, moments when you could hear yourself think. The pressure in Lenora's head began to ease. Copper raised his ears and whined softly, sensing the change, knowing that something was different. It is ending. Another day, maybe less. The worst is over. Prudence Pemberton, who had complained about everything for a week, burst into tears. Emmett Tanner, the young man who had bet on Lenora's death, knelt beside the fire and prayed. The children began to smile. Little Rosie, who had lost her parents but gained a protector in Sheriff Virgil, laughed for the first time in days. And Lenora sat by herself in a corner, holding baby Hope against her chest, allowing herself to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from the feeling of a purpose fulfilled. Chapter 7, The Reckoning. On the ninth day, February 18th, 1884, the storm finally broke. The wind stopped. The snow stopped. The sudden silence was startling after 9 days of constant noise. It was like going deaf, like the world had been screaming for so long that the absence of sound felt like a physical weight. Lenora went to the entrance and looked out at what remained of Copper Ridge. The town was buried under 15 feet of snow. Only the rooftops of the tallest buildings were visible, small islands in an ocean of white. The church steeple poked up like a finger pointing at a sky that had finally decided to show mercy. Drifts were piled 20 feet high in some places. Trees had been snapped like twigs. Fences were gone entirely. The landscape had been completely transformed. Nothing looked the same. Nothing would ever look the same again. But the sun was shining. For the first time in 9 days, there was light. Real warm, golden light. It reflected off the snow with such brilliance that it hurt to look at. People who had spent more than a week in darkness wept at the sight of it. "We need to check for survivors," Lenora announced, "and we need to do it carefully. More people die after storms than during them. Overexertion, getting lost in snow canyons, falls. We go slow. We go together. We do not take unnecessary risks." She organized rescue parties, teams of 3, each with someone who knew the town well, each with rope to tie themselves together, each with supplies in case they got trapped. Sheriff Virgil insisted on leading the first team, despite his injured hands, despite the 2 fingers that were black and would have to come off, despite the pain that showed in every line of his face. "I spent a week lying in this cave while you saved my life. I am not going to sit here while others do the work." Lenora looked at him for a long moment. "Just do not die out there. I put too much work into keeping you alive." The rescue parties found 14 more survivors, people who had barricaded themselves in cellars, a family who had survived in their barn, huddled together with their horses for warmth, an old woman who had been buried in her house and survived by drinking melted snow from a pot she held against her body, a young couple who had crawled into a root cellar and stayed there for 9 days eating preserved vegetables and praying. They were half frozen, half starved, half dead, but they were alive. They also found the dead, 8 people who had not made it. Prudence Pemberton's sister Abigail had died in her fine house on the edge of town. She had refused to leave, convinced that her solid walls and modern windows would protect her. The windows had shattered on the second day. Snow had filled the rooms within hours. They found her in her bedroom, wrapped in every blanket she owned. Still not enough. Old Mr. Kirkland, who ran the livery stable, had stayed with his horses. The stable collapsed on the 4th day. They found him still holding the bridle of his favorite mare, frozen together in death the way they had worked together in life. A young couple recently married, found in each other's arms in their small cabin. The roof had caved in under the weight of the snow. They had probably died quickly. There was some mercy in that. A widow who lived alone at the edge of town. No one had thought to check on her. No one had remembered she existed until it was too late. A drifter passing through town. He had no one to warn him, no one to tell him about the cave. He had died in a shed behind the general store, alone and unknown and far from wherever home had been. The parents of little Rosie, found 100 yards from their farmhouse. They had been trying to reach town, trying to find help. They had died within sight of the road that might have saved them. And Reverend Ephraim Whitmore. They found him in his church. The building had survived the storm. The walls were solid, the roof was intact, but there was a crack in the ceiling. A small crack that had widened under the pressure of the snow piled on top. The cold had poured in through that gap. They found him kneeling at the altar, his hands folded in prayer, his eyes closed, his face peaceful. He had died talking to his God. Dr. Caldwell brought Lenora the Reverend's journal. His hands were trembling. "You need to read this, the last entry." Lenora opened the journal to the final page. The handwriting was shaky. Written by someone whose hands were freezing. Someone who knew he was dying and wanted to leave something behind. February 17th, 1884. "I was wrong about Mrs. Ashford. I called her work pagan when it was providence. I said God put us above the earth while she built a shelter in the earth that is saving dozens of lives. I prayed to God for salvation while she built it with her own hands. I have spent 2 years mocking a woman who was doing God's work better than I ever did. I called her names from my pulpit. I encouraged others to shun her. I was proud and blind and foolish. If anyone finds this, tell her I understand now. The meek shall inherit the earth, and sometimes they also save it. God forgive me for my pride." Lenora closed the journal. She did not speak for a long time. The silence stretched out in the main chamber of the cave. 20 people watched her, waiting for her reaction, waiting to see what she would say about the man who had condemned her from his pulpit. She handed the journal back to Dr. Caldwell. "He died making peace with his God. That is more than most people get. Bury him with respect." That was all she said, but it was enough. The town meeting was held in Lenora's cave. It was the only space large enough and warm enough for the surviving population of Copper Ridge. 41 people gathered in the main chamber, sitting on the sleeping platforms, leaning against the stone walls, crowding together in the space that had saved so many of their lives. The air was thick with emotion. People who had not spoken to each other in years sat side by side. Former enemies shared blankets. Children who had witnessed things no child should see huddled close to their parents. Lenora stood at the back of the chamber, near the medical station where she had saved Sheriff Virgil's life and delivered baby Hope. She did not want to be the center of attention. She never had. Mayor Aldrich Pemberton stood at the front. He had survived the storm in his wine cellar, alone, terrified, rationing a single candle and a jar of preserved peaches for 9 days in complete darkness. He had been found on the third day of rescue, dehydrated and barely coherent. Now he faced the people he had led, the people he had failed. His hands were shaking. His voice was hoarse. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 days. "I owe Mrs. Ashford an apology. We all do." The chamber was silent. 2 years ago, this woman came to our town and began building something none of us understood. We called her crazy. We called her a mad woman. We said her work was an embarrassment to our community. We tried to have her committed to an asylum. He paused, his voice cracked. "She tried to warn us about this storm. She came to my office and told me exactly what was going to happen. I dismissed her. I told her to go back to her hole and stop scaring people." He looked directly at Lenora across the length of the cave. 27 people survived because of you. 27 people who would be dead right now if you had listened to us, if you had given up, if you had stopped building. He bowed his head. "I was wrong. We were all wrong, and I am sorry." Dr. Caldwell spoke next. He stood with difficulty, leaning on his crutch, his broken leg throbbing with every heartbeat. "I have degrees from 2 universities. I have practiced medicine for 40 years. I told this woman she was mentally unbalanced. I offered her sedatives when she tried to warn me about the storm." He shook his head slowly. "I know less about survival than a widow who learned from her minor father. Mrs. Ashford, I apologize for my arrogance. I hope you will accept my gratitude instead." Sheriff Virgil held up his bandaged hands, 2 fingers gone. "A price paid. She saved my life. She saved little Rosie's life. She did it knowing what I had done to her. Knowing what I had said. She forgave me before I ever asked. His voice broke. That is the kind of person she is. Emmett Tanner walked to the front of the chamber. The young man who had once bet $5 on Lenora's death reached into his pocket. He pulled out a handful of coins and crumpled bills. I was a fool. I was cruel. I was everything a man should not be. I would like to give these $5 to Mrs. Ashford and another 50, every dollar I have, to help expand the shelter so it can save even more lives. He held out the money with trembling hands. One by one, the people of Copper Ridge came forward. Some offered money, some offered labor, some offered simply their thanks and their shame. They came to Lenora with tears in their eyes and apologies on their lips. And Lenora accepted each offering with the same quiet grace that had carried her through 2 years of mockery and 5 years of grief. She did not gloat. She did not remind them of the cruel things they had said. She did not demand anything in return. She simply accepted their apologies and told them to go in peace. When the testimonials were finished, old Silas Brennan raised his hand. I have a motion to make. I move that we officially recognize these caves as the Copper Ridge Emergency Shelter. I move that we compensate Mrs. Ashford for every cost she has incurred over the past 2 years. And I move that we adopt her design and expand it so that every citizen of this town has a place to shelter when disaster strikes. The vote was unanimous. Chapter 8, The Years That Followed. The work began that spring. Men who had never done a day's manual labor in their lives hauled limestone rubble alongside farmers and blacksmiths. Women organized supply drives and cooking rotations. Children helped carry water and sort provisions. The entire town worked together for the first time in anyone's memory. Lenora supervised everything. She taught them about limestone and ventilation and the constant temperature of the earth. She shared every secret her father had taught her, every technique she had developed on her own. She held nothing back. Knowledge that is not shared dies with us, but knowledge that is taught lives forever. By summer, the cave system had doubled in size. New chambers had been excavated and reinforced. A schoolroom had been added so children could continue their education during emergencies. A meeting hall had been carved out where the entire town could gather. And at the entrance, a bronze plaque had been installed. The Ashford Caves, built by Lenora Ashford, 1882 to 1884. Expanded by the citizens of Copper Ridge, 1884. They called her mad. She called it preparation. 27 lives saved. February 1884. 1 year after the Great Storm, Lenora Ashford married Dr. Phineas Caldwell. The wedding was held in the main chamber of the caves. Reverend Michael Donnelly, who had replaced the late Ephraim Whitmore, performed the ceremony. Cordelia Garrison was the matron of honor. Little Rosie, now 6 years old and officially adopted by Sheriff Virgil Cranston, and his wife, was the flower girl. She walked down the stone aisle scattering wildflowers and giggling. The sound of her laughter echoed off the limestone walls like music. Baby Hope, a healthy 1-year-old with her mother's curious eyes, was passed from arm to arm throughout the reception. Everyone wanted to hold the miracle baby. Everyone wanted to touch the life that had been born in darkness and survived. It seems fitting, Lenore said, that we begin our new life together in the place that gave us all a second chance. Phineas raised his glass. To second chances. And to the woman who made them possible. The years passed the way years do in small towns. Slowly, gently, with the rhythm of seasons and the quiet accumulation of days that eventually become a life. Lenore and Phineas never had children of their own. They were too old, too tired, too worn down by the lives they had already lived. But they became surrogate grandparents to half the children in Copper Ridge. Their home was always full of young people, asking questions, seeking advice, learning the old ways that Lenora's father had taught her and that she now taught them. Every Sunday, Lenora held what she called cave lessons. Children would gather in the main chamber while she explained how the earth worked. She showed them how to read weather signs. She taught them which plants could be eaten and which could heal. She explained the science of caves and ventilation and survival. She passed on everything she knew, holding nothing back. The children loved her. They called her Grandmother Stone. She cherished that name more than any title the territorial government tried to give her. Sheriff Virgil Cranston retired in 1889. He lost 2 fingers to frostbite, but he gained something more valuable than fingers: peace. He spent his remaining years helping expand the cave system, teaching survival skills to young people, making up for the years he had spent mocking the woman who saved his life. He never forgave himself entirely for what happened to Ezra, for the friend he had abandoned, for the cowardice that had haunted him for 5 years. But he learned to live with it. He learned to transform it. The way had taught him, little Rosie grew up calling him Papa. She was the daughter he never had, the family he never expected, the redemption he never thought he deserved. When she was 18, she announced that she wanted to become a school teacher. She wanted to teach children the way Grandmother Stone had taught her. Virgil cried at her graduation. He died in 1903, peacefully, in his sleep, with Rosie holding his hand. His last words were of gratitude, to the woman who had saved his life, to the woman who had forgiven his cowardice, to the woman who had shown him that it was never too late to become a better man. Jessamine Hollister remarried in 1887, a school teacher from Helena named William Crawford, a kind man with gentle eyes who loved her daughter Hope as his own. They had 2 more children, both boys, strong and healthy and full of life. But Hope remained special. She was the miracle baby, the child born in darkness who brought light wherever she went. She grew up in the caves, running through chambers that her grandmother Stone had carved out of solid rock, playing in passages that other children feared to enter, learning the secrets of limestone and water and earth. When she was 18, Hope announced that she wanted to study engineering. She wanted to design shelters that could save lives, the way Lenora's cave had saved hers. Lenora wept with joy. She gave Hope her father's journal, the old leather book that Cornelius Trelawney had filled with notes about mining and caves and the secrets of the earth. Guard this, add to it. Your knowledge should grow, not just preserve. Hope kissed her forehead. I will make you proud, Grandmother Stone. You already have. Emmett Tanner never gambled again. The young man who had once bet on a widow's death became the foreman of the cave expansion crew. He spent 3 years working alongside Lenora, hauling timber and cutting limestone with the same hands that had once slapped money on a saloon counter. He married a school teacher in 1886. He named his first daughter Lenora. When people asked him why, he said the same thing every time. Because she let me in when she had every reason to leave me outside. In 1890, Copper died. The old dog had been with Lenora for 11 years. He had followed her through everything. Through the grief of losing her family and the loneliness of 3 years wandering. Through 2 years of back-breaking labor while the world laughed. Through 9 days of darkness in a cave where 27 people learned what it meant to be saved. He had been her companion when no one else would come near her. He had sat at the cave entrance watching her work, patient brown eyes following her every movement, his tail thumping against the stone floor whenever she spoke to him. He had comforted crying children during the storm. He had rested his chin on the knees of frightened people and reminded them, without words, that they were not alone. He had done the work that no human could do. On his last day, Lenora carried him to the entrance of the cave. She sat with him in the sunshine, stroking his gray muzzle, telling him what a good dog he had been, the best dog, the most loyal friend she had ever known. She told him about Ezra and Josiah, about how he had tried to keep them warm in the snow, about how he had survived when they could not, about how he had been her reason to keep living when she had wanted to give up. He died peacefully in her arms. His nose pointed toward the sun. His tail gave one final thump against the ground. Then he was still. Lenora buried him at the entrance to the caves, where he could watch over the shelter he had helped protect, where his spirit could greet everyone who came seeking safety. The headstone was simple. Copper, 1879 to 1890. He found me in death. He stayed with me in life. The best friend a woman could have. Lenora lived for 22 more years. She taught her cave lessons every Sunday until she was too weak to stand. Then she taught them sitting down. Then she taught them from her bed. Then she taught them with barely a whisper, but she never stopped teaching. She watched Copper Ridge grow from a small town to a thriving community. She watched the caves expand from a single chamber to a complex system that could shelter hundreds. She watched the children she had taught grow into adults who taught their own children. She saw Hope graduate from engineering school, the first woman in Montana to earn such a degree. She saw Hope design shelters that were built across the territory, shelters that saved lives in blizzards and floods and fires. She saw the legacy she had built spread far beyond anything she had imagined, and she was content. Lenora Ashford Caldwell died in 1912. She was 80 years old. She passed peacefully in her sleep. Phineas was holding her hand, the same hand that had bled for 2 years building a shelter, the same hand that had delivered baby Hope, the same hand that had forgiven enemies and comforted children and pointed the way to safety for so many people. Her last words were of Ezra and Josiah. She smiled as she said their names. She was going to see them again. She was finally going home. The funeral was the largest Copper Ridge had ever seen. People came from all over Montana to pay their respects. Governors and farmers, doctors and miners, teachers and engineers, children who had been born in the caves and grandchildren who had never known a world without emergency shelters. They came because one woman had refused to stop building, even when the whole world told her she was wrong. They buried her in a special chamber of the caves, alongside a memorial stone for Ezra and Josiah. The family reunited at last, the husband and wife and son together in the earth that Lenora had loved. The inscription read simply, Lenora Ashford Caldwell, 1832 to 1912, wife of Ezra, mother of Josiah, healer of many. She turned tragedy into purpose. She turned mockery into grace. She prepared the way for all who came after. Chapter 9, The Discovery. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University came to study the Ashford Caves. They brought modern instruments and scientific methods. They measured temperatures and airflow and structural integrity. They analyzed limestone formations that were nearly a century old. What they found amazed them. The caves maintained a constant temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly as Lenora had said. Winter measurements taken during a blizzard showed the same temperature as summer measurements taken during a heat wave. The earth, as Lenora's father had taught her, kept its promises. The ventilation system she had designed worked as efficiently as any modern engineering. Air moved through the caves in a continuous cycle, drawing in fresh oxygen, expelling carbon dioxide. No mechanical assistance required. No pumps, no fans, just the natural physics of warm air rising and cool air falling. The researchers calculated that the system could support 50 people breathing normally for an indefinite period. The structural supports she had installed showed no signs of deterioration. The limestone had actually bonded with the timber over the decades, creating a composite structure stronger than either material alone. Modern engineers would have recommended replacing the supports after 50 years. Lenora's original work had lasted nearly a century and showed no signs of failing. The lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Sarah Whitfield. She had spent 20 years studying historic structures. She had examined buildings designed by trained architects with university degrees and decades of experience. She had never seen anything like the Ashford Caves. This woman had no formal training. She had only the wisdom passed down from her father and her own determination to save lives. What she accomplished with hand tools and limestone is what modern architects accomplish with computers and steel. She paused, looking around the chamber where 27 people had survived 9 days of the worst storm in Montana history. The only difference is that she did it 100 years earlier. But it was what they found in the deepest part of the cave system that truly stunned them. A small chamber, hidden behind a narrow passage that most people walked past without noticing. A passage that looked like just another crack in the rock, just another shadow in the darkness. The researchers almost missed it. One of the graduate students noticed scratch marks on the stone floor, marks that suggested someone had crawled through the passage many times, marks that had been worn into the rock by years of repeated passage. They followed the marks into the darkness and found Lenora's final gift. She had carved her knowledge into the stone, not on paper that would crumble to dust, not in books that would rot or burn, not in memories that would fade with the people who held them. Into the stone itself, diagrams showing how to build ventilation systems, drawings of support structures that would hold for centuries, lists of supplies needed for survival, instructions for reading weather signs, techniques for treating frostbite and delivering babies and setting broken bones. Everything she knew, carved into limestone that would last for millennia. The chamber was covered in her writing. Every wall, every surface, careful letters carved with tools she had made herself. Diagrams so detailed that modern engineers could follow them without additional instruction. She had spent years on this work, years of crawling into this hidden chamber and adding to the knowledge carved into the walls, years of thinking about the future, about the generations that would come after her, about the storms that would rage across Montana long after she was gone. She had thought of everything. She had planned for everything, even her own death. Dr. Whitfield stood in that chamber for a long time, reading the words carved into the stone, tracing the diagrams with her fingers, feeling the dedication and love that had gone into every stroke. She understood something that the researchers who came after her would write about in academic papers and scientific journals. Lenora Ashford had not built these caves for the 27 people who survived the storm of 1884. She had built them for everyone who would ever need shelter, for the children of Copper Ridge and their children and their children's children, for strangers she would never meet, for people who would not be born for 100 years. She had built them for hope. The paper Dr. Whitfield published made Lenora famous. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the widow who had built a shelter while everyone laughed, about the caves that had saved 27 lives, about the wisdom carved into stone that still worked perfectly after a century. Schools started teaching her story. Universities studied her engineering techniques. The Ashford Caves became a national historic landmark. Thousands of people visited every year. They walked through the chambers where 27 people had survived 9 days of darkness. They saw the sleeping platforms in the medical station and the storage rooms that held enough supplies for weeks. They traced their fingers along the carved instructions that Lenora had left for future generations. They read the bronze plaque at the entrance. The Ashford Caves, established 1882, National Historic Landmark, where 27 souls found shelter from the storm. Preparation is love made visible, and they left changed. Some of them went home and started preparing for emergencies of their own. Some of them donated money to preserve the caves for future generations. Some of them simply told the story to their children and grandchildren. They kept her memory alive. They kept her legacy growing. The Great Storm of 1884 killed over 200 people across Montana Territory. But in Copper Ridge, only 8 died. 8 people who might have survived if they had listened. 8 people who might still be alive if they had not been too proud to accept help from someone they considered beneath them. Lenora Ashford did not build her cave for revenge. She did not build it to prove she was right and everyone else was wrong. She built it because she lost everything she loved and decided that loss would not be meaningless. She built it because 15 feet was too far for her husband and son to walk, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure no one else ever fell short by that distance again. She used to say that grief has 2 paths. The first path leads inward, toward bitterness and isolation, toward anger that burns everything it touches, toward despair that grows deeper with every passing year. The second path leads outward, toward purpose and service, toward building something that matters, toward transforming pain into something that helps others. She chose the second path, not because it was easier. It was harder in every way that mattered. It required her to face her pain every single day instead of hiding from it. It required her to help people who had hurt her. It required her to forgive when forgiveness seemed impossible. But the second path led somewhere. It led to 27 lives saved in a limestone cave during the worst storm anyone had ever seen. It led to a baby named Hope, who grew up to save hundreds more. It led to knowledge carved in stone that would help people for centuries. It led to a legacy that changed how an entire territory thought about disaster and preparation. It led to peace, and it started with 15 feet of snow, and a woman who refused to let that distance define anything but her determination. Preparation is not paranoia. It is love made visible. And sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only one who sees the storm coming.